My name is Jeffrey Sidoris, and welcome to another episode of Process Driven. In this episode, I'm sitting down with Sam Faulkner, a photographer from the UK who, for the last 5 years, has been making portraits of reenactors for a project called Unseen Waterloo. I saw a couple images from the project at this year's Paris Photo LA and was blown away, so I reached out to Sam and asked if we could have a conversation about how the project came about and what inspired him to make the transition from conflict photojournalist to fine art photographer. It's a fantastic conversation. Here we go.
Please listen carefully.
The book's idea really came about from discussing it with the designer. I was working with a very talented English designer called Phil Cleaver, who has made many beautiful books, not just photo books, but just all sorts of kind of illustrated books and also typeset books. It's what do they call it? Kind of proper letterpress kind of set books, and he's a master of typography, and so it was a kind of very enjoyable experience working with him on the process. And one of the reasons that I went down the road of working with Phil directly and essentially self-publishing this as opposed to working with publishers was because I really wanted to control it. I wanted to. On the whole, photographers don't make money from photo books. It's whatever we like to say about it. There is they are mostly vanity projects. There are very few photographers that I know of, anyway, publish photo books in order to actually make serious money. They might cover their costs and they might make a little bit, but surely the most important thing for a photographer is to create the book that they want, the book that represents their work in the best way possible. And that's the way I came into it. Realizing that actually, if I'm never going to make money out of this, why should I make compromises?
Right. You're making the book that you would like to see of this project, sure.
Exactly. So, if I went to, I'm not saying they necessarily would have published it, but Pride and Passion or someone like that, I would have had to have made creative compromises in order for them to have been able to publish it the way their business model works. And
which may or may not have been in line with your own.
Sure, exactly. But I still wouldn't have made any money out of it. So for me, creatively, it was much more interesting to work with Phil and Patrick, the editor, and try and build the book from the ground up, ourselves, and and just have a product, or not even a product, a kind of an object that I was incredibly proud of, and I felt really represented the work the best way possible.
How does one go from a combat photographer, a combat photojournalist, to a fine art photographer? Can you talk a little bit about that journey and kind of what inspired that transition? And did you know that this was the project that you wanted to be your first project, assuming that it was your first project, when you kind of changed gears?
Yeah, it certainly was the beginning of that kind of transition, or that change. And it was a very conscious change. I came into photography through reportage, documentary photography, and really a kind of desire for adventure. And I think as soon as I left university, within weeks of leaving university, I kind of took myself off to Afghanistan during the period of the Civil War, which was just before the rise of the Taliban, and there was a kind of nasty, forgotten conflict between various Mujahideen factions that had been allies against the Russians, and now they were kind of fighting each other for what was left of the country. And I went over there kind of looking for adventure and taking some pictures. And that was really what started me as a photographer and as a reportage photographer. And really, it became about, to start with, I guess, something exciting to do, but also trying to tell stories. And one of the things that's always been very important for me is to create, to narrow the distance between the person in the picture and the person looking at the picture. I find, which is kind of very old-fashioned kind of reportage idea. And one of the things I don't know whether it's been getting a lot of play over there, but over here there's kind of the Bruce Gilden pictures that have been around.
Sure.
I find those horrific, and what part of the thing that I find horrific about them is that it extends the distance between the person in the picture and the person looking at them. It doesn't create any sympathy or empathy between the subject and the viewer at all, and I just find that runs very counter to everything that I've wanted to do with my photography.
And have you wanted to tell stories in that way since the beginning?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah,
I think that first trip to Afghanistan, I shot a project which was very naively shot. A handful of pictures almost. I think I had spent almost 2 weeks in Afghanistan, and I came out with, I think, 5 rolls of Tri-X in 2 weeks.
In 2 weeks, wow.
Yeah. So, and compared to what you shoot now on digital, it's quite laughable.
And were you shooting for someone at this time, or was this independent?
Not really. No, that was literally just going over there and having a bit of an adventure. I was over there with my friend Phil, and he has since gone on to become a journalist. And we were just looking for stories, and those pictures did win me an award for Young Photojournalist, the Ian Parry Award, which was a great start to my career and got me kind of talking to the right people very early on. And so I was had a kind of gilded path to start with.
Sure.
And this was very much what I wanted to do. Kind of really wanted to try and explore what it was to that connected everyone. Whether it was someone in a conflict area in Africa or a conflict in Afghanistan or maybe South America, and just really try and bring stories that connected with people, whether it's in Europe or in America. And I guess by the time I started the Waterloo project in 2009, a few things were changing, not least the market. The market for this sort of photography was disappearing. It was getting
the market for reportage and documentary
for that sort of for that sort of stories that I liked shooting was getting harder and harder to get commissions.
Was access getting more difficult as well?
No, I actually don't think so. I think maybe I wasn't really covering the Iraqs or the Afghanistans from the sides of the Allies. I was, last time I went to Afghanistan, I did the story that I shot was very, I think it was 2003, was about the wedding industry in Kabul, which was basically a kind of very positive, upbeat story. And I think I shot it at a time where probably at the peak of optimism in Afghanistan, actually, because it all went downhill a bit after then. And, it's still obviously nowhere near as stable as everyone would have hoped it was after, so long.
Sure.
But at that time, there was a lot of the refugees who've been in exile in Iran or in Pakistan were returning, and there was the Taliban were, pretty much invisible at the time, and there was very much a sense of optimism in Kabul, and there was kind of a building frenzy, and a lot of these businesses that had been suppressed under the Taliban were reopening. So you had things like the kind of wedding videographer and the beauty parlors that had all been closed. So I was kind of shooting. I shot this story, and I had a commission to go off and shoot it, which was about the whole wedding boom, and all the refugees were coming, and everyone, obviously during a time of conflict, everyone delays getting married. And now this was a time of peace, and everyone was getting married, and suddenly this whole business or this whole industry kind of boomed around, getting married, and it really caught the moment of that moment of optimism in Afghanistan. But I think more than anything, the thing that changed was the market. That was a commission from a magazine, and they paid expenses and a fee. Now you'd be expected to go off and shoot the story, and then maybe sell it for £1,500, $2,000 when you got back, which wouldn't even cover your costs.
Sure.
The market's just gone. The magazines don't have the money that they used to have. When I started out, kind of 96 or something like that, I was a kid. Must have been 23 or something like that. I went up to the Sunday Times magazine in London, and the picture editor at the time, Aidan Sullivan, took me up there and showed me around. And he pointed out these two massive filing cabinets, which were basically full of stories they'd commissioned, but never actually got around to publishing yet. And these were
so they were paid for?
They were paid for. These were stories that they had paid for, and they were prints and transparencies in there, and there were two absolutely full filing cabinets full of things like that. Nowadays, that magazine or any of the other equivalent magazines will not pay for a single picture unless they know exactly which issue it's going in.
Wow.
That whole business has changed.
And this was about what year that you really started to see it change?
Yeah. I guess it was I think it was interesting. It was a kind of time that it was the boom of the internet, the boom of digital photography. Costs of entry were reduced, and I guess it was the kind of halfway through the first decade of the new millennium, really. The kind of 2004, 2005. But by 2009, which is when I started the Waterloo project. I'd changed as well as a photographer. One of the key things that was very instrumental in me starting the Unseen Waterloo project was that I made a conscious decision to actually just throw away everything that I've been doing before. So, I don't mean throw it away. I just mean just reappraise everything that I've been doing before. So instead of shooting with a small handheld Leica, on this I was shooting with a Hasselblad with a massive phase one back, tethered to a computer, cameras on a tripod, and I'm shooting it, lighting the situation, whereas normally everything that I'd ever shoot was available light. I was shooting something that was essentially artificial, in a reenactment, as opposed to what was always real and in front of me. Previously everything that I'd been photographing, it was much more about kind of capturing moments and just being present and being a witness to what was going on. Whereas this was photographing something that essentially wasn't there, which was this 200-year-old battle.
So just a massive shift.
Yeah. And that's really what I really thought, okay, one of the things that I was very interested in became more and more interested in, was actually photography. The idea of photography, not just the kind of the technique of photography, but the idea of what photography is about, and the role that photography plays in kind of our visual understanding of situations or an issue or an event. So, and the more I explored Waterloo, the more interested I became in the role of how photography had changed war war photography had changed the way we remember conflict, and the impact that photography had on the public's understanding of what it's like to be in a war zone. And Waterloo was being the last conflict before the invention of photography. We very much remember it as the conflict between Napoleon and Wellington, the two great generals who we've seen, beautiful portraits of. You have the Goya portrait of Wellington, and you have David's of Napoleon, and some of the greatest artists in the world in history have painted these two guys. But what we never had were any pictures of the fighting men, the men that died that day.
Sure.
200,000 men who were on that field. This is a small battlefield. This is about 2.5 miles by 2.5 miles.
Wow.
And even after two world wars and 100 years later, 200 years later, we've never had so many horses and men fighting in such a confined space. So even for example, the great offensives of the First World War, like the Somme, that was over a 14-mile front.
Right.
So,
and this is 2.5 miles on a side.
Yeah, 2.5 miles.
Wow.
So it's incredibly confined. And by the end of the day, the battlefield was littered and deep with bodies. But sorry, I'm getting a little bit off. So
no,
anyway,
that's okay.
I was interested in how photography changed the way we remember conflict, because by the time we get to the First World War, which was 100 years exactly after Waterloo, the First World War is very much remembered in the terms of the men who fought, the kind of courageous Tommy and for the British guys who were in the trenches, and it's very much seen from the point of view of the individuals fighting it, rather than the big generals and the officers, who were, to some extent, considered buffoons because they never, they caused so much needless slaughter and had very unimaginative ideas about how the conflict should be fought. So over that 100 years, what we had was a kind of democratization of imagery. We had images of all the men instead of just the generals, but we also had a democratization of memory, in the sense that we are remembering the individuals instead of just the officers. So I was kind of quite interested in whether those two things were related, whether we remember conflicts differently once we can see the actual people who fought in them.
When you went into this, did you go into this project knowing that it would take 5 years to complete? Did you plan for that kind of commitment?
No, absolutely not. The very first time I went off to shoot it, I went there kind of expecting, just wanting to shoot something in a very different way. As I said, just think about photography in a different way and approach photography anew, using different techniques, different ideas, but essentially, obviously with the same eye, because that's the one thing that I can't do anything about.
Sure, that's kind of the unifying field between the
exactly.
two. Sure.
So, and I did that first weekend, and very, very soon afterwards, as soon as I got back and I started looking at the pictures, I was compelled. I need to carry on doing this, because actually, I've only got another 5 years until the anniversary, and there's something here. I immediately felt I wasn't quite sure what it was yet, and it has taken me a while to really kind of come to distill the essence of what I think drew me towards it. I just saw that there was something interesting and something that was intriguing about these images, and so I just straight away said, okay, that's it. My next 5 years, I'm going to be working on this thing. And it's not a massive commitment. It's one weekend a year over 5 years. So it's overall the whole project was shot in 10 days, but over a 5 year period. Whereas obviously some photo projects are shot much more intensively than that over even longer periods. But obviously over that time, it gave me a lot of opportunity to kind of think about what I was doing, constantly reappraise the images and kind of understand what I was photographing. Because I think certainly at the beginning, I thought, okay, I'm going to go off and shoot this thing, which is essentially artificial. And I didn't want to shoot it in a reportage way. I definitely didn't want to do that because, it would be really bogus to try and shoot a battle reenactment. So the idea was to kind of try and create isolated portraits that you can't see that they're actually shot on the battlefield of Waterloo, but hopefully once you look at their faces and look at how they're carrying themselves, it becomes obvious that they couldn't have been shot anywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
If you look closely on some of the faces, you can see the black on their lips, and this is from tearing the cartridges that have the powder in.
Oh, sure, the black powder.
They poured,
wow.
Yeah, the black powder which they poured down the muzzle, and so this is something that the actual soldiers at Waterloo would have had too. They would have had these very black lips, and these guys are the reenactors are sleeping out in bivouacs for the weekend, so they're not looking clean shaven, they're not looking pristine, and I didn't want them to look perfect. I didn't want them to look like parade ground soldiers.
Sure.
The idea was because I feel the work is about the soldiers of Waterloo, not about reenactors.
What were some of the criteria that you used to select not only who to photograph, but when to photograph them?
One of the most important things was trying to get kind of an array of different uniforms, because the other thing about Waterloo, which is interesting and probably actually makes it a more interesting exhibition than pretty much doing it about any other battle, is the array of uniforms,
mm-hmm.
because it really absolutely was the kind of peak of military fashion. 100 years later, again at the First World War, most of the uniforms would have been drab and khaki, or later camouflage, and there was very much a sense that everyone had to kind of blend in, as a unit, but also to their surroundings.
Right.
Whereas at Waterloo, the idea was that your regiment had to stand out, and it didn't matter that you were wearing red, because to be honest, you were only ever likely to be killed by someone who's a few meters away anyway.
Right.
So you didn't need to hide into or blend into the background, because by the time you got that close, camouflage is no good anyway.
Sure.
So the whole rise of camouflage and khaki is to do with the mechanization of war, how the killing distance of the weapons extended, and therefore, if you managed to conceal your position, you were able to maybe survive a bit longer. So that's one of the other things about Waterloo is just these incredibly beautiful uniforms, and that's an absolute blessing that these reenactors spend so much time and money making the uniforms. So,
and are they each responsible for their own uniforms?
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
That's right. So you'd be in a regiment and they'd study them, and I guess this is one of the incredible things about the internet. So in another thing that perhaps you've never even thought about is the way these guys are able to share information now in a way that perhaps they wouldn't have been able to do before. So and the research that they put into them, and you are spread out geographically in a way that perhaps they never would have been before, and they can obviously arrange much bigger kind of battles and coordination and things like that. So it's kind of weird that this the kind of modern technology has really fed into this or very much helped keep alive this historical reenacting thing.
And how many people are we talking about? How many soldiers are we talking about in these battles?
This year was a particularly big one. I didn't photograph this year because my project finished, before the anniversary. But this year, I think they had 5,000, and normally
5,000. Wow,
5,000. Yeah, normally it's fewer than that, but because this year was the big 200, they decided to, everyone came out of the woodwork to have a go.
Do you think this had to be, I guess thematically, did this have to be the first sort of large scale project like this that you took on, somehow tying to this sort of previous life of reportage and combat and conflict?
I don't think it had to be. I think it makes sense that it is, because going back to what I was saying earlier about how the motivation for my photography has always been about creating a connection between the viewer and the subject and kind of narrowing that distance. I think this work does that too. I think you look at these pictures and hopefully from that you will take away a greater understanding of what it might have been like to be a 19th century soldier, or to have been at the Battle of Waterloo, or to maybe to reenact, but hopefully it's slightly more profound than that.
Were they receptive to you from the beginning?
This is interesting. Yes, they were. I think there was a little bit of a suspicion, because most of the photographers that turn up to these things, they want a very kind of almost cliched picture of like one of these guys in their 19th century uniform drinking a can of Coke, or Napoleon on a mobile phone, or Wellington, I don't know, playing with an iPad or something.
Right.
You know what I mean? They really, it's the kind of thing newspapers lap up, and
sure.
they just that juxtaposition of modern and old, and it's just an easy smile, isn't it, for a paper after a reenactment,
sure,
and things like that. And obviously I wasn't interested in that, and convincing them that in fact I wanted to do it straight, and I wanted to do it very high end, and it's very hard for them to kind of understand exactly what I was doing to start with. After a couple of years, we printed off a little blurb book so we could show them the work in progress, where we got so far, and that really helped. And also we kind of sent out out of camera postcards to everyone after we'd done it, so they can the word got around, and by the time we'd done it a few years, people were expecting me, and greeting me as an old friend, shall we say. And there were, I think there's one chap who managed to get himself photographed every year. So
oh, really? In the same uniform, or would they switch uniforms?
No, he managed to. I think he had 3 or 4 different uniforms.
Sneaky.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, I've seen you.
No, I think the first time I did it, I thought, cheeky bastard, I did. And it was funny because actually he was one of the very first ones I shot, and actually it is that first image of him that is the keeper. None of the other ones actually made it into the edit of the book or the exhibition, but that first one is actually one of the strongest ones, and was probably one of the images that actually worked so well from that first shoot that really kind of motivated me to continue. So despite having another 4 goes at it, I never improved on that first one.
How did the idea of the deliverables evolve over the 5 years? Did you know going in that you wanted to do books and prints, or did one or the other emerge kind of as the project went on?
No, I think really, I think I must have shot at least 3 years before I'd even started thinking about what I was going to do with it, or where it was going to end up.
You just knew you wanted the photographs.
I knew I wanted the photographs, and I knew that I just needed to keep going. And then, as time got closer, I would have a body of work which I could then kind of start thinking what to do with.
Mm-hmm. That sounds like that's something in and of itself that was quite different from your sort of previous work.
I'll tell you, one of the other things that is what very different about this is actually finishing it. As a photographer, I just want to keep going on things. I find it very hard to say that's it, that project's over, unless it's an assignment. I go away for 2 weeks and I shoot, and they come back, and then it's over. But personal projects,
knowing when to quit.
Knowing when to quit and knowing when to say that's done, or let's move on to something else, or there's always something else that I want to add, or something else I think I can do. The thing about this one, because we had this anniversary deadline, I knew it had to be done by then, and therefore, the end was always in sight.
Right.
It was always in the calendar, and to be honest, I think that was very important, because I think if it had been another 15 years to the anniversary,
would you still be shooting?
Probably would.
Out there every year.
Let's just slog on for another few more years. But so it was just enough distance away for it to be, an achievable goal, and also significant enough for it to actually have created a body of work that's, not, disposable. But coming back to something else we were talking about, which was when we discussed the deliverables, I think what suddenly changed it from this becoming a project which was ongoing to something that really was going to be the big art project for my career, or the first big art project for my career, was
hopefully not the last. Yeah.
Well, hopefully not.
Yeah.
The last. I wanted to rephrase that to make it.
And I'm done.
Was when I showed it to Patrick Kinmonth. Patrick Kinmonth is this incredibly talented kind of creative director of operas, set designer, and I met him years ago when I was working alongside Mario Testino. As he and Mario go back years and years. They worked for Vogue on Vogue together during the 80s, and they're kind of lifelong friends. And I was doing various bits with Mario, following on from a commission I had, which was to do for GQ magazine, which was kind of to shoot a project about the kind of world's most glamorous fashion photographer. And I met Patrick, and we stayed in touch and were friends. And although we hadn't spoken for ages, and then I suddenly called him out of the blue and said, "Look, I really want to show you this work." And he seemed to fall in love with it straight away, and had wonderfully high ambitions for it immediately. Ambitions beyond my wildest dreams, really. And I think it was his belief and support for the project that really enabled me to kind of think, yes, let's do this book the way I want to do this book. Let's kind of go for this exhibition at Somerset House, and everything else that followed on.
Fascinating that his was the name that you pulled out after not speaking for so long. Yeah.
Yes, it was just suddenly that my wife Sabina used to be Mario's producer, and we were just talking about this one night, and she said, "Oh, you've got to give Patrick a call." And from that, it absolutely took off.
Now, how many prints are you doing? Actually, bigger question: how many final photographs did you end up with versus how many did you take over the 5-year period?
I think we shot about between 250, 300 individual kind of individuals or kind of individuals. So either on horseback or standing. So yeah.
And what did you end up with as final prints? How many?
In the exhibition, there are 71, and I think in the book there's about 110. I can't remember actually off the top of my head, but yeah, I think it's about 110. So yeah, it's some of the choosing them was some of them were obviously self-selecting. There are a lot of ones that were just definite.
That's the one. Yeah,
and then we start thinking, well, do we have that uniform? And then then I have to get into the whole historical research bit. It's like, that's a really nice picture, and then you check and that's a Russian regiment, and the Russians weren't there. Because often at these reenactments, they're Napoleonic reenactments.
Sure.
It's supposed to be reenacting the Battle of Waterloo, but this
liberties are taken.
Yeah, exactly. This guy turns up in a Russian uniform of the period.
Right.
And he was fighting on essentially the right side, but it was like at the time I took the picture, I wasn't aware, and then you go back and check it, and it's like, damn, can't use that one.
Right.
So, and then you kind of go through and you think, well, that guy doesn't look believable. He doesn't.
In context, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, or he's not inhabiting that uniform. He's not wearing the uniform in a way that someone who's been marching for days, sleeping in his uniform, and fighting in his uniform and getting drenched in rain and everything else. I don't know. It just doesn't look right. He's not inhabiting that uniform.
Feels like more of a costume,
yeah,
maybe.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. So it feels like a costume rather than something he was, living in. So those guys were out, and then you just need to try and think. And we got sponsorship from the Dutch embassy, so we've got to make sure that we've got enough Dutch guys in there and things like that. So yeah.
Where did the idea for the Thin Red Line version of the book come, and was there always the intention to use, because you guys used the actual wool from the actual mill that the soldiers were clad in? Yes.
This was Patrick Kinmont, who I just mentioned, is an exceptionally creative guy and really has this enormous vision. And within an hour of me showing him the initial work, which was years ago, he said, wouldn't it be great if we had this fabric behind, this Hainsworth fabric, and we could use that, incorporate it into the show? And I was like, yeah, okay. At that point, I wasn't really buying it.
It doesn't sound like you were all that sold on it.
Yeah, I was like, well, I can't really see. It's a photo exhibition.
Right.
What's all this fabric got to do with anything? And he just, it was his gigantic vision that just meant that this idea that he had, years ago suddenly, ultimately came to fruition in, probably exactly the same way he thought of it in that instant. And because we got Hainsworth involved, and they were the ones that were making the fabric, that were the British, that very bright red fabric that the British infantry wore at Waterloo.
Wow.
Was made at the same mill as it is still made today up in West Yorkshire. And while some of the processes have changed, essentially it is the same fabric.
Wow. Did you get a chance to go to the mill?
Oh, yeah, I did. I went up there and we shot a little video of them making the fabric for the exhibition, because I think they gave us something like 200 meters
of
this fabric for the exhibition. And
wow.
With covered all the walls in this and it's incredibly rich, dense fabric, and the color is amazing. It just jumps out, and because the images are so dark, and it just really works incredibly well. And so we went up there and watched them making the fabric, and it was incredibly exciting just to see this stuff come off that was being made specially for us, and it was all wonderful process. And we decided that we'd like to make this ultimate edition of the book, which we were kind of all the way down the line. We were thinking of what materials we could use, and we were talking about leather and things like that. And it then just became obvious, actually. Let's use this thin red line, this Hainsworth fabric, and have it embroidered in silver. So the map design that we have on the cover of the 1815 edition is transferred or translated into silver embroidery for the thin red line edition. And the embroidery was very much playing on the ideas that the embroidery on the uniforms and the kind of that regalia that the guys in the pictures are wearing.
Sure. Yeah, so it's a beautiful touch.
Continuing that.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I mean, you talked about might have even been before we started recording, but the importance of this as an object. And
absolutely, yeah.
You've really succeeded in this. I mean, obviously, I haven't seen that particular version of it, but in seeing the copy that I have and in seeing the photographs of that version of the book, I can only imagine just how amazed you must have been seeing that first one out of the box.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely it's just incredible, and the amount of skill going involved in it as well, because obviously we've taken the pictures and we've had it designed, and then it's been printed over in Italy, by the wonderful photographic printers in Verona, and then we have these what they call book blocks, which are the inside of the books, and then we had to kind of send that over to the book binders. But before that, we had to get the panels embroidered, and that's one of the embroiderers that we're using in London are the guys that do stuff for the royal family, and they do stuff for the military, and they really top of their game stuff. And so we've got some. It's just wonderful to be working with craftsmen as well,
right?
Because it's not just making the book and just a kind of a machine just churning it out.
Sure.
It is once it's been printed, it's then going off to craftsmen to actually be finished, and
right.
They do the embroidery, and then that's sent over to the book binders, and then they have to send it back to the embroiderers for finishing, and there's a huge amount of work involved, and it's an expensive book, but hopefully it's everyone who's got one kind of feels it's worthwhile.
Well, it's such a brilliant idea that the photographs are not the end of the process; they're really just the beginning of it. Sort of your work on this edition is largely done, but then, as you just said, it's still got this whole other series of steps to go through before the object is complete, and that must be just immensely satisfying to see that.
Yes, yeah, no, it is, and it's not being without problems. Dealing with craftsmen, you get delays and you get bottlenecks and things like that. So it's not being with an unstressful process, but it is incredibly rewarding to actually see this really, really fine book
right.
They're producing at the end.
And what versions of the prints are there available? Are there different sizes, or is there only one size?
Well, basically there are two sizes, which are the life-size version, which is the one that's in the gallery. In Somerset House, the exhibition in London, and then we do a smaller size, which I think is roughly equivalent to A2 size.
So the life-size version must have been what I saw at Paris Photo, right?
Yes, that's right.
And that was, I think, when we first spoke, you had mentioned that was the first time that any of the work had been seen
Yeah,
publicly.
no, absolutely. So Hamilton's Gallery in London representing the work, and they are they took it to LA, which I think was end of April.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right?
Yep.
So it's that was the first reveal of any of the work, which kind of they're doing a fantastic job with it, and I'm really very excited to have such a kind of fabulous gallery to support.
Sam, it was incredible. I mean, it was you walk out of this space and round this corner, and there are two of them, and you're struck by one, just the enormity of them, but two, the denseness of color in the coats, in the uniforms. They're just amazingly rich.
And this is another thing that I could bore on about for ages and ages. Getting these prints right was hard. We, London has some of the best photographic printers, in Europe, if not the world, and they really are, some great printers over here. But I was struggling to find the printers who could really nail this. I tried, 4 or 5 different printers, and some were getting scuffing in the black because there's so much dense black ink on there, and there was something that was happening in the machine that was just touching the paper, and you just get this mark in the black. Because I decided on this paper ages ago, and it was very much my vision that certainly at I guess the prints you saw weren't done quite like this, but at the exhibition in London, we've framed them but without glass, because what I wanted to do was I wanted to minimize the amount of barriers between the viewer and the subject. So you really are looking straight into the eyes of this soldier, whose life size right next to you.
And you're seeing the surface of the paper.
Exactly, and you're seeing the surface of the paper. And this is the kind of German etching by Hanne Mühle, which is a really very, very matte, kind of slightly textured paper, and it really takes the ink. The blacks are just so dark and charcoal. Something that we tried lots of other different processes, but it was the depth of this black that really just had this kind of infinite quality to it that we just loved.
The change in the gear, the change in the process, the change in approach, how has it affected your work moving forward, both technically and aesthetically? Do you see this as having a profound effect on everything that you shoot from here on out? Or is it more of a one-off, like you wouldn't want to do this level of project or this type of project again?
No, I definitely don't think that's the case. I definitely do want to do another project like this. I think this is definitely the whole process has been so fascinating. Even from the first shoot until the exhibition opening has just been an absolute blast. I've enjoyed every minute of it, and having learned so much on this, it would be absolute waste not to try and do it again, because surely it must be one of the hardest ones to do. The first one, a 5-year project, and exhibition and a book and everything else that we've done is finding a fantastic gallery like Hamilton's. That's we worked very hard to get all those things in place, and I've got a couple of ideas of things that I want to do, which I think are the continuation of this. I think it would have seeing this work will inform, the next work will be informed by this work. And I think it would have been a bit of a jump just to do, gone from the reportage to the next project. So this is a very, very important intermediary stage that I think has helped me learn a huge amount. And I think one of the other things that this project's really got me thinking about is photography. And I'm interested in I've never been interested in shooting anything other than people really before. I've done taken a few still lifes, a few landscapes and things like that. Which has always been part of bigger projects.
Right.
But,
never a focal point.
Yeah, never really a focal point. But now I'm interested in perhaps exploring those things. I don't think that's where my next project lies at all. But I think what this process has taught me is that actually it's creatively really important just to kind of try something new, just do something completely different, approach something, in a brand new way, and just try and make it work. Don't think, okay, I'm a documentary photographer, and okay,
what am I allowed to do?
That. Yeah, exactly. And I'm really interested in just trying a few things out, playing around. And as I mentioned before we started recording, I love taking photographs,
right.
And I think more than anything, it's reinforced that actually, this is something that I love doing, and I just want to carry on doing it in any way that I can, whether it is reportage, documentary, or this kind of more conceived art project, or something else. Just taking pictures fascinates me, and I guess I'm becoming more fascinated by the process of taking pictures, and what the pictures mean, rather than just being caught up in the moment and the adventure of taking pictures. It's very
much more the architect of the image now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Making the images, sure. Do you see maybe a redefinition of the type of photographer you are overall, or will you still continue to do reportage or some of the things that you've done in the past?
I don't know. This is one of the things that I've constantly struggled with in my own mind. I've probably spent far too long thinking about this, whether it's better to be a kind of very specific kind of photographer. So, you are the guy that shoots those incredibly lit studio portraits of animals or something like that,
right.
Or whether you are more like a Nadav Kanda character who, does beautiful portraits, but also does, great advertising work and, these artistic landscape pictures. Whether it's better to pigeonhole yourself and have something really that people can come to you and think, every time they think of that kind of picture, your name springs up.
Sure.
Or whether, I think I've answered the question for myself now, which is actually, I don't want to be in a pigeonhole. I want to just shoot pictures, and I want to be a photographer. I think that's what this project has taught me. Yeah.
I'd like to thank Sam for being so generous with his time. If you would like to see images from the Unseen Waterloo project, head over to unseenwaterloo.co.uk, where you can also purchase a copy of the book, which is fantastic, as well as postcards and a great set of posters. You'll find more work by Sam Faulkner, including his gorgeous Eagle Hunters project, on his website at samfaulkner.co.uk. You can follow Sam on Twitter and Instagram at FaulknerPhotog. That's FaulknerPhotog. Links to some of the people that we talked about in this episode can be found in the show notes at jeffreysadouris.com. And if you enjoyed the conversation, please share it and subscribe either on iTunes or in your favorite podcast app. And if you know someone interesting you think I should talk to, you can find me on Twitter or Instagram at Jeffrey Sadouris. Thanks so much for listening. I appreciate you being here, and I will see you next time.